Welcome, everyone. I'm Amy Seeley, president of Seeley Test Pros, helping students to succeed on all kinds of tests from 8th grade to grad school in Cleveland, Ohio.
I'm Mike Bergen, president of Chariot Learning, helping students with tests, school, and life based out of Rochester, New York.
Between the two of us today, we have over 50 years of experience at the highest levels of the test preparation and supplemental education industries.
We both love to talk and learn about the latest issues in education, testing, and college admissions. So let's get down to tests and the rest. The fascinating topic we want to explore today is deciding between the SAT and ACT Part 2. But first, let's meet our special guest, Heather Krey.
Passionate about helping her students achieve their college dreams by being their coach and cheerleader as they prep for the SAT and ACT, Heather Krey is an experienced instructor with teaching certificates in math, physics, chemistry, and English. She knows the best tips and strategies for these tests, and she also understands that students need encouragement and practice to do their best. With dual bachelor's degrees in industrial engineering and psychology from Lehigh University, she also holds master's of education degrees in mathematics from DeSales University and in teaching from Kutztown University. Heather lives in Allentown, Pennsylvania, with her husband and 3 children. Heather is the author of a newly released book, SAT and ACT Combo Test. Welcome.
Thank you, Amy.
Heather, it is so great to have you on again. This is something that's very exciting for me and Amy because this is the first time we've done an official sequel to a podcast. We've had a two-parter that split over, but this is the first time that we've had a guest come back to revisit a topic we've discussed. And of course, deciding between the SAT and ACT is a topic that you can go back to again and again.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite topics, actually. So there you go.
There's an important reason why we asked you to come back at this moment. But first, just remind listeners who you are, what your journey through test prep has been, and maybe some new developments in your life.
Well, thanks, Mike. Sure. Well, I'm the owner and director at Test Prep for Success. It's a tutoring center in Pennsylvania. And it was a long journey to get here. I think I discussed it a little bit more in part 1 when we spoke earlier. But I did start as an engineer, and I morphed into becoming a teacher, and then a mom, and then finally a business owner. And I tell, with all the different changes I've made in my life, I like to tell my students, I don't regret one thing. There's nothing that I ever learned that I don't use pretty much every day. So just keep learning, and you never know what's going to happen or when it's going to come in handy.
It's a great philosophy. What is it that you've learned recently? I mean, you were an engineer, you became a teacher, then a business owner. Have you taken on any new roles?
Absolutely, yes. Now I'm into being an author, and I learned how to publish a book. And that was another brand new adventure for me. I've never done anything like that before. I've learned a lot about the industry, the self-publishing industry, because I always assumed that was the move of desperation when no publisher would pick up your book, and that has changed now. That's how most books are coming out. And I had to find myself an editor and a publisher to work with me, and we had a great team of 3 ladies, and I think we came up with a fantastic product. It's available on Amazon now. So it's kind of cool. I go to the website every day just to say, like, oh, look, there's my book on Amazon.
And Heather, what exactly is this book?
This is, the title of it is SAT and ACT Combo Test. So it is a small, non-intimidating 64-page book. And the first half of it is a test that you sit down and take as a student. It's about 2 hours long, and is a mini SAT and a mini ACT put together. And then the rest of the book helps you grade the SAT, helps you explore what your experience was as you were taking them, and decide for yourself what you think is the best path forward for you. And some students will decide that one test is better, and other students will end up taking both of them. And they'll at least know going in.
So tell us a little bit about kind of where did this idea come for you to kind of write a book like that? Because there really aren't books like that, at least on the market, that I can think of.
And that's a big reason I chose to publish it, because I didn't see any options like that, and I wanted one for my students. Here in Allentown, about 90% of the students are going to take the SAT. It's just sort of the traditional practice. The schools all offer the PSAT to their sophomores, but there's no pre-ACT that's similar. And so they just sort of get funneled in to the SAT, plus the parents on the East Coast all remember having taken the SAT, like I did when I took it in the 90s.
Do you feel like this was an opportunity then to expose more of your students to the ACT in, let's say, a more meaningful or productive way?
Exactly. I'm constantly trying to explain, not really to the students, more so to their parents, that it's okay to take the ACT. It's a valid test. Colleges will like you if you take it. Many of them don't believe that.
So that leads to an interesting question that I'll pose to both of you. Before we talk about deciding between the two, do students need to decide between the two in the outset of preparation? Do you feel like it's necessary before you begin a class or instruction that you should have a clear test in mind?
Well, I will take that one. Well, I think ultimately, if we value our students' time, and let's say maybe they don't have a lot of time, and that could either be they don't have a lot of time to practice in a week, or maybe there are tests coming up that there's not a lot of time to fit in prep. I definitely think that if you can launch your prep with one test, that is my preferred methodology.
Heather, how about you?
It is so dependent on the student and what their needs are. I have had several students, actually their moms, come in and say, I think my kid can go to an Ivy League. We're going to do whatever it takes. And then, well, I know they're going to take both tests, right, if they're in that category. But then I have other ones who come in and, you can tell they are not excited about the process. Any extra studying they have to do is not really, they'll do it, but they're not going to look forward to it. And then you do want to help them get to their goal as quickly as possible without the extra bells and whistles.
I'll say my position is a little different, notwithstanding the emergency. Somebody shows up and there's really only one test date that works for them, and you have to focus on that test regardless of fit. I like the process of, through instruction, helping students determine which test might be best for them. And again, that goes to the idea that these exams fit certain students different ways, because on one level, we may all agree that the SAT and ACT have never been more similar than they are today, right? I mean, it's no analogies. The SAT has adopted a lot of what made the ACT great. So what do we see as the differences in terms of which kinds of students do better on either exam?
I agree with you, Mike, and it takes people like us to care what the SAT used to be like rather than what it is like now, right? It's like
because we still pine for the analogies. I know you do.
Some of us, maybe.
I sometimes post them on LinkedIn because they are fun, those analogies, and they're still in the SSAT. So sometimes I get to study them.
It's like the good old days when you go back to the SSAT, right? It's the good old days, like or the IC. Oh, I get to do sentence completions. Thank you very much.
But you were saying, Heather.
Oh, yeah. So I was saying, when they do ask me which one is better for them, it usually comes down to the math and whether or not they're comfortable with a no calculator math section, and whether or not they're able to work at this speed that the ACT requires. Because I think the most distinctive part of the SAT is that no calculator math section, and the ACT in general is just that you have to work so much more quickly. And so different students have different strengths and weaknesses, and you want to pick which test is going to extenuate your strengths.
Now I'm just curious, from a writing the book method, how were you able to incorporate that into the combo test as far as the speed feature versus or the calculator versus no calculator? How did that go?
That's a great question. Well, the combo test is 8 sections. And so the 4 of the sections are going to be exactly modeled after 4 of the ACT sections. and the timing will be proportional. So for instance, the ACT math section is 60 questions in 60 minutes. On the combo test is going to be 15 questions in 15 minutes. So you'll have the exact same pacing. The questions will go from easiest to hardest, but they're going to just be fewer of them. And it will work like that for the 8 SAT sections as well. I'll have one no calculator section, and then that will be combined with your answers from the with calculator section, just like it is on the real test.
That's tricky. So you pulled out 2 of the major differences between the tests, right? On the ACT, students can use calculator on every math question. On the SAT, they can't, and that is a deal breaker for some kids. On the ACT, the reading section, the grammar section, the science section, they all require students to read and understand at a rapid clip. So
absolutely,
those are 2 of the biggest issues. What are some of the other smaller differences that you may see? I'll throw one out there and get your perspective on it. Some people say that SAT reading gives students more time per question, but may be a little trickier. Is that your experience as well?
I do. I think that the reading passages on the SAT are at a higher difficulty level, especially what they call their founding documents. Yeah, right. Well, all of them, I think, are harder than on the ACT. And my students ask me all the time, they said, I've heard that the ACT is easier than the SAT. And I'll tell them, you're right. I agree. The problem is they're both graded on a curve. So just because it feels easier when you take it doesn't mean your score is going to be higher after it gets calculated.
So then clarify that for me. The ACT is easier than the SAT. You're saying it's easier to get a higher ratio of correct to incorrect answers?
I think so. Gosh, in the grading part, it was based on ratio like that. So I don't know. I do think that.
Well, from the perspective
similar
of the official, right? There are a certain number of questions we're finding that you can miss, right? And still be able to get a perfect score on the ACT. So for example, in December 2019, I think students were able to miss maybe 4 questions in English and still come back with a 36. And maybe it was a couple questions you could miss in math and science, or maybe 1 in reading. So when you do the math on that, you're like, wow, you could miss, 10 or 12 questions and still have come back with a 36 composite. SAT, we never see that, right? If you don't get them all right, you do not get a perfect score. At least we have not seen, right, any recent SATs where that was possible.
At least not on the math sections.
Right. So I think that's probably something, even since we recorded the last podcast, I think we saw that in April and June and December 2019's ACTs, where that trend was missing, you still could come back with a perfect score. And then the opposite of the SAT, you can't miss anything, or you miss 1 and you drop precipitously, so that
was a big problem on the SAT, especially on the high performing math students. If you miss 2 questions, it was down to like a 730. And it was for students who had a 730 and they wanted to increase their score, sometimes they could get more questions right, but end up with a lower score based on the difficulty level.
Right. We've seen that too. So that must have really been challenging for you, Heather, when you were trying to put together a scale to score the hybrid test, to deal with the intricacies and inconsistencies of the official score tables for the last 2 years. I mean, every test that comes out, we look at the scale and we're like, wow, this is crazy. And it's like year after, month after month, it's still difficult to really understand.
So when I wrote the SAT sections of the combo test, I modeled it as closely as I could to the difficulty levels of the practice tests 1, 3, and 5. And then when I looked at the scoring, I didn't use any scoring tables other than 1, 3, and 5 for the initial, for putting together my scoring table. So that was my basis. And then I did, of course, also have ACT questions and I had my own questions, not theirs. So I gave it to a group of a dozen students, and I found that my science section was too difficult, and I had to tweak some things in my my SAT English section. And so I didn't actually change the scale. What I did was I made some questions easier. And then I went through and I gave it to another group of students, and that was much better. And then just before publication, we did it one more time with 4 students. And I'll tell you, it is not a perfect system, and that was never my goal, was to make a perfectly valid test. But I do think it is valid enough to be a useful tool, and I'm very pleased with that. But if you do want a perfectly valid score, of course you should take the official test. So I'm not trying to compete with the official test. I'm trying to give a level of convenience that they cannot. And so I do think that validity was sacrificed to an extent for convenience, but you get something for that sacrifice.
Well, that's what's funny about it, though, is it just speaks to, for the actual test writers, right? How crazy it must be to try to put items together and then score it. I'm no psychometrician, but that to me is a mystifying process.
Well, what's the calculation that it takes approximately $1 million to create one official SAT?
Which is true.
And that is
Absolutely.
a lot of work on every single question, and then piecing those questions together sequentially, including everything that needs to be included, leaving out the things that shouldn't be included. It's an incredible task.
And testing every question item on real students, and sometimes you get surprises.
Well, I don't know that they do that effectively anymore.
Which
is where some of the inconsistencies in the scaling may come from.
Absolutely.
So then, Heather, so what you're saying is that a hybrid SAT-ACT diagnostic isn't the be-all, end-all, but it is a tool where you gain a level of convenience in trying to determine which way to go.
Absolutely. Hey, have you ever had a student come into your office and you'd say, well, what are you thinking about for your plans for the future? And they're like, I don't know. You tell me what I should do, right? And you ask them, well, you have the choice of the SAT or ACT or maybe both. Have you thought about which one you want to focus on? And they're like, nope, I don't know. What do you think I should do? And they're really overwhelmed by the idea of this process. And it can be so anxiety producing, and people can get a little bit too worked up about it. And so for those students who aren't going to get too worked up about it and need to get the most they can out of the smallest amount of time, I think this is a great answer to them. And it's a way to get them started so that they can make their own decisions, and they don't need you to tell them what to do, or mom or dad to tell them, oh, you're going to do the ACT on July 13th, and that's how it's going to be, right? If you give them this 2-hour test, which they might be willing to take, and not feel too intimidated by the length of it, they're going to come out on the other side not only with scores, but they're going to know what they're getting into with both tests. They're going to know what the questions look like. They're going to know how fast they have to work in order to finish on time. And they're going to know how they feel at the end of 2 hours of testing. And so all of that together, I think, gives them a great deal of experience and helps the students, it empowers them to make their own decisions based on some good information.
So I think this might be a good point to segue into some things that are very different since we last spoke, which of course leads me to bring up the topic of modality, right? As far as how is a student taking the test? Obviously, we know that in the past, all of our students have taken the test paper and pencil. So Heather, do you want to talk a little bit about what are some of the things that are on the horizon for test modality between the SAT and the ACT?
Yeah, that is a very interesting topic because both of those SAT and ACT have plans to go online in the future, but the plans have not been crystallized yet. So there's a lot of more questions than answers. ACT is further along. They are currently offering it online in some locations and internationally. SAT plans to do it not only online, but also in the student's home. So now the ACT is thinking they might do that as well, but it's still maybes.
The other thing, though, to talk about with the idea of the computer is, of course, the fact that the computer is being utilized for single section testing, right? So right now, currently,
for the ACT.
Right, for the ACT. But SAT right now, if to our knowledge at this day and time, right, we can say that with the SAT, if you sign up for the test, even if we're offered on a computer, you must sit for the whole exam, correct? But ACT, if you have the availability of online testing, you have the ability to sign up for, one section at a time or two or as many as 3 sections. So how do you think that might impact student performance, Heather, being able to do 1 section versus a 3-hour test?
Well, the ACT has actually done a lot of research before they made this change. And they have released a lot of that information. So the super score will be higher, and they are encouraging colleges to look at super scores for ACT rather than the highest single day score. And that will tend to be higher, but it is more predictive, according to their research, of future college success. So it's better to use the super score. And then you can only utilize single section testing if you're looking at it from a super score perspective, because you have to be willing to mix up the reading test from one day and the science test taken a month later and put them together to form a super score.
Yeah, we had a great conversation with the ACT Senior Director of Research, Krista Mattern, on exactly that, on the ACT super scoring and section retesting in episode 75. And it's interesting how much further along ACT is on exploring the implications of single section testing than SAT is. Like, we were surprised just to hear that there might be some kind of ESAT on the horizon, but ACT is taking the digital future into areas that we haven't heard College Board exploring yet.
Right.
Well, I think there's a natural reason for that, and that's that the SAT has 2 scores, a reading, writing, and a math, whereas the ACT has 4 scores, right? The reading, writing, math, and science. And so you would get a lot more of an advantage by super scoring an ACT than you would by super scoring an SAT. And colleges, there are many colleges that will super score the SAT, but not the ACT. So I think the ACT is more motivated to explore this.
That's
it's another advantage Amy just found out about, is that it allows ACT to sell single section books.
They're already on Amazon. Yep.
Yep, exactly. But that's an interesting point, though, because with ACT, you talk about 4 single section scores that are all on the same scale, right, of 36. And then you average to get your overall composite. With SAT, it is really 2 scores out of 800. And yet the 1 score out of 800 is made up of reading and writing. So
it's really 4 sections anyway. College Board could very easily retrofit if they wanted to follow that.
But that might be what they have to think about doing if they're trying to keep up or compete with that single section retesting.
Oh, hopefully they listen to this podcast.
We'll share with them.
All right, let's wrap up then. Final thoughts, Heather. You've spent a lot of time over the last 6 months thinking about the differences between the SAT and ACT and how students should decide between them. What's one final piece of wisdom you'd like to share on that?
Well, everybody's different, and I think the student has to decide for themselves. My daughter, I just went through this, I'm a mom, and my daughter is 17 years old, and she took the SAT and ACT practice tests here in my office. She didn't take the combo test because I didn't finish it in time for her to need it.
Oh, Mom.
Couldn't be your guinea pig.
I'll tell you, she hated the ACT. That's her. I certainly have plenty of opposite students, but for her, the tight time just caused her, she does have anxiety issues, and it caused them to explode. When we got her ACT score, it was actually equal to her SAT score, and she did not care. She was not going to take that test again. And that was fine. We took her word for it, and she did a fantastic job. We're so proud of her, and this is all in her past now. She did well enough. She never has to take it again. But we went 100% SAT, not even based on the score, but based on her own decision after she got to experience both of them. So that's really something I'd like to give to the students who use this book. It's more than just a score, is having the experience and then being able to make your own choice.
Terrific. Well, obviously we could talk about deciding between the SAT and ACT all day, maybe all week, but unfortunately we are out of time. Thank you so much, Heather, for joining us today.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Amy.
If listeners want to get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Certainly, I'd ask you guys to go to my website. My business is called Test Prep for Success, and the website is tp4s.com, tp4s.com, and I'm sure you'll put a link to it right by this podcast.
Awesome. We hope you enjoyed this discussion as much as we did. Be sure to join us for another fascinating topic and guest on the next Tests and the Rest.
Did you enjoy this episode as much as we did? Find expanded links and more for this and all of our episodes at our show page at testsandtherest.com. While you're there, be sure to explore everything the larger TestBright site has to offer, including real, expert, unbiased answers to the toughest admissions testing questions. Of course, we'd love for you to rate, review, and subscribe to Tests and the Rest on your favorite podcast platform. If there's a topic or guest you'd like us to feature, just let us know and spread the word.